All right, welcome to Property Rights in the Constitution. This is number 8 in the lecture series in the Constitution. And we're going to talk today, obviously, about property rights. I want to start out with some thoughts about that. When you think about how America was started, when the people from Plymouth Rock first came over, right? The Pilgrims, when they first came over, what did they say? They said, we're good Christian people, we can trust each other. Let's set up a communal system. Let's work together and everyone will work hard and everyone will get the rewards of those labors. What happened? The first couple winters, the first couple years there, they almost starved because they lived in a communistic society. They trusted each other. Oh, well, we'll all be fine. Okay. Eventually, William Bradford said, "Look, this isn't even really a decision. We have to do this. We're going to give every person their parcel of land and say, you either produce or you die. Your survival is based on whether you take care of your own food and feed your own family." And what happened? Almost immediately, almost immediately, things changed. And they started to be very productive, even to the point where within just a few seasons, they were having the Thanksgiving feast, right? All kinds of plenty. Because before, in communism or a communal society where everyone's property belonged to everyone, people said, "Man, my ankle kind of hurts today. I'm not going to go out to work. I'm sure it's all right. Oh, I've got to do some washing today, so I'm not going to go out." But when it was put on them, and they said, "It's now my responsibility to feed myself," they said, "I don't care if my ankle hurts. I need to go out and work. I don't care if I'm washing. I'll do that later, but I've got to work while the sun's shining." Okay? And so there's some basic ideas there that teach that communal living, property communism doesn't work. Okay? Think look at two commandments of the 10 commandments. Thou shalt not steal. That's based on what? The idea of private property, because you can't steal something if it doesn't belong to someone else. Thou shalt not covet, the same idea. Okay, so it's these basic ideas that are entwined in just some common sense foundational truths. And we're going to look into property rights and see what the Constitution has to say about property rights. Okay, so let's start out with John Locke. John Locke, in a lot of ways, is the founder's founder, okay? The founders looked to many people. John Locke was one of them, especially in these types of natural laws, natural rights. He says this: "The great and chief end, therefore, of men's uniting and putting themselves under government is," and how would you fill in that blank? Why do people unite in government? He says it is to preserve their property. That's why they unite, is to preserve their property. Okay, so theft, fraud, breach of contract, trespassing, confiscation, destruction of property, that's all deterred with the legitimate functions of the government. Okay, and that's why people join into government. He goes on, George Washington says this: "Private property and freedom are inseparable." Are you really free if you don't have private property? No. Okay, he who controls the property controls the means of production, and the means of production are the means by which you survive and live. If you don't have private property, you're dependent upon somebody else. Okay, along that same vein, John Adams says, "Property must be secured or liberty cannot exist." Okay, if your property can be taken from you at any point, you're not free because you're dependent upon the control of other people, and they control that property. Okay, so kind of some basic foundational quotes from the founders and even predating the founders. Now let's look at, we've talked about the Declaration and the principles of the Declaration over and over in these presentations, but I want to get this idea firm in our minds. It's very, very important as we talk later about property rights, this idea of where our rights come from, etc., etc. Okay, in the Declaration it says, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." Okay, we've already talked about this. Who gives us our rights? God does. Okay? And we have the right, the inalienable right, to do what we want to with our life and our liberty and our property, as long as we don't infringe on the life, liberty, and property of someone else. Okay? Now, that's what freedom's all about. Freedom to do and become, achieve whatever you want to do with your private property. Now, the next sentence says this: "That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men." So very clearly, what is the role of government? The role of government is to secure our rights, or, if you use the 2 P words we talked about in the first presentation, is it to protect or to provide? Okay? Their job is not to provide or to plan. Their job is to protect. Okay? Their job is to protect our rights. Now, if we are protected in our rights, then guess what? We're the ones who get to plan and provide for our future by the use of our life, our liberty, and our property, because they're protecting, that's their job. But when government says, "No, we're going to plan for you, and we're going to provide for you," that's not the proper role. Okay? We're in charge of planning and providing with the help of God. Okay? Now, George Washington makes a pretty simple statement here. He says, government is not reason, it's not eloquence, government is force. Like fire, it's a dangerous servant and a fearful master. When you apply that to what we just learned about in the Declaration, the only legitimate use of force or government, because they're synonymous, they're the same thing, the only legitimate use of force is to protect our rights. That's it. That's the only time force should be used. Okay? That goes along with this last part of the Declaration that says, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. Government only has just powers in these two cases. Okay, some people say this is one-pronged. As long as we consent, the government can do whatever we want them to do. But it's two-pronged. You first have to have the power, and then you have to consent to give it to the government. If I don't have the power as an individual to use force in a situation, then I can't give the government the power to use force in that situation, because it's bottom-up government. We talked about these principles before, right? It's bottom-up. I'm endowed with the right, and I delegate to government the power and authority that's associated with that right to employ force in that endeavor. And that should be a protective function, to protect my life, my liberty, and my property. Otherwise, it's outside the scope of what government should do, because it's doing something unnatural, something I can't do, and therefore I can't give to them something, a power that I myself don't have. Okay? Now, that's just a review. You may say, well, that's great, and what does this have to do with private property? It has everything to do with private property, and we're going to get into it here in a little while. I like how Frédéric Bastiat, he's one of my heroes. He's a great writer, great thinker. He says this: it seems to me that the rights of the state can be nothing but the regularizing of pre-existent personal rights. For my part, I cannot conceive a collective right that does not have its foundation in an individual right. Okay? Hence, to know whether the state is legitimately invested with a right, we must ask whether the individual has that right in virtue of his nature and in the absence of all government. In other words, do I have the right, this is what we said earlier, right? This is the Declaration of Independence is saying. Do I have the right individually? If I do, then there can be a collective right that's based around that government can do as well. Now, do nations, states, communities, do they have rights? They don't. Only individuals have rights. He goes on to explain this a little bit more. He says, if every person has the right to defend, even by force, his person, his liberty, and his property, then it follows that a group of men have the right to organize and support a common force to protect these rights constantly. Thus, the principle of collective right, its reason for existing, its lawfulness, is based on individual right. Okay? If I have a right, I delegate the power and authority. I don't delegate the right, I delegate the power and authority. And there's a collective power there to do what I on my own could do. Okay, so I'm repeating myself over and over, but I think it's important to say the Declaration says this, Frédéric Bastiat says this, logic itself says this. It's important to understand as a basic foundational principle when we start to talk about a little more sticky issues when it comes to property. Okay?